In one of my favorite books, the author Don Carson writes, God doesn't demand hectic church programs and frenetic schedules. He only wants his people to know him more intimately. He only wants his people to know him more intimately. He goes on to say a deeper knowledge of God brings with it massive improvement in purity, in integrity, in evangelistic effectiveness, in better study of the scriptures, in improved private and corporate worship, and much, much more. God only wants his people to know him more intimately. In the book, he suggests that one way you and I can do that is to read the scriptures, particularly the great prayers that are found in the scriptures. If you want to know God, listen to those who are speaking to God in the Bible in their prayers. And Jonah chapter 2 is just one such prayer that will teach us much about God if only we will listen. The problem is most of us get distracted from the prayer because there's something fishy going on here. You noticed? We don't even get to the prayer because we're distracted by the fish. We say to ourselves, in fact, we were driving home from a function last night, and in the car we were debating, was it a fish or was it a whale? Because that's what we want to know, don't we? Was it a big fish? How did he not know? Did he know? I mean, can you imagine? Matt said just now, being swallowed by a fish. Did he know he was swallowed? Did he realize that? Was it a green fish? Was it a pink fish? Did he smell? What was it like inside? Was it dark? Was there light? How could he see? You see, what happens is we get so distracted by the fish debate, we forget about what's really happening. And the truth is, we should learn to say only what the scriptures say. See, here's what the scriptures say. Do you see it there, verse 17? The Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah. That's what we know. That's what we know definitively and authoritatively. We know that the sovereign God of the world miraculously ensured that there was a fish big enough to be right there at the right time to do the right thing, which in this case was to swallow Jonah. We're not meant to be distracted by the fish, actually. Rather, what we're meant to be doing is saying, what is God doing with the fish? Why has God done this? And in fact, we'll discover as we read chapter 2 that it's not about the fish at all. It's about what God is doing with Jonah inside the fish. And we've already had a bit of a hint in chapter 1. You see, we've already learned that God is concerned to save the Ninevites. We've seen how God has already saved a group of pagan sailors. And I want to suggest to you this morning that what we see in chapter 2 is God saving Jonah. We see God saving Jonah. And so we read in chapter 2, verse 1, in the darkness of the fish, in the belly of the fish, from inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord. See, as you and I read his prayer this morning, we see his experience of God's grace. A lesson that we must learn for our journey of faith, just as he had to learn it for his. And so the first thing I want you to notice from his prayer is, will you notice verse 1, from the depths of the grave. From the depths of the grave. I don't know if you are anticipating that one day you will die. It's a pleasant thought, isn't it? It's the kind of thing you want to think about on a Sunday morning. Jonah anticipated death. And he anticipated that his death was very real and very imminent. That's why he speaks from the depths of the grave. In his mind, it is as if he has died. Whether that is because he was drowning in the deep, he was swirled around by the currents, and so he thought he had died. Whether or not he thinks in the belly of the fish, maybe he didn't quite realize he'd been swallowed, and he's now sitting in the dark. Maybe in his mind he's thinking, I've literally gone to the grave. I am now in the place of the dead. We're not sure exactly how he understood his death, but here's what we do know. We do know he's come face to face with it. Face to face with death. His death. A death he knows he deserves. In fact, at the end of chapter 1, we were told, he confessed to the sailors that he is the reason for the storm. He is the reason that they are in danger. He is the reason for the calamity, he says in verse 12. See, he had turned from God's word. He had run from God's presence. And he knew the consequence of that was death. See, he knew that. The New Testament writers will put it nice and succinct for us when in Romans chapter 3 they will remind us that the wages of sin is death. The wages of sin is death. And so as we come to the depths of the grave here in Jonah chapter 2, we are meant to see here a picture of divine judgment. This is a picture of divine judgment. Jonah knows that his punishment is punishment at the hand of God. He knows it is God's judgment upon him. Look at verse 3. You, talking about God, you hurled me into the deep. Look at verse 4. Banished from your sight. This is something that you are doing. You are separating me from your presence. At the language of the engulfing waters, the imprisonment beneath the earth, those are pictures of judgment. Here is Jonah being held accountable for sin. And so we're meant to see death as judgment upon sin. We're meant to see that. But I wonder if there's a shock for us here. See, you and I expect bad people to be judged. Truth is, we actually want bad people to be judged, don't we? We expect pagans to be judged. In fact, we'd like them to be judged. We'd like taxi drivers particularly to be judged. Twice on Sundays, we think to ourselves. But what about nice people? What about nice people? What about you? What about you? See, we must remember that the person being judged here is an Israelite of the chosen people of God with a special covenant relationship with God. And we must remember that the person being judged here is not just an Israelite, he is an Israelite prophet. He is a servant of God. His family name means friend of God. He's one of the good guys. He's one of the nice guys. Surely God's judgment comes upon the bad people, the wicked people, the evil people. No, dear friends, Jonah chapter 2 teaches us that God will deal with sin wherever he finds it and in whomever he finds it. It doesn't matter your ethnicity, it doesn't matter your morality. There is no excuse, there is no escape. If you're a sinner, you will face judgment. And the judgment for sin is death. I know that's a very strange thing to say in the modern world. I know there might even be some people here today who are saying to themselves right now, what an idiot the oak is up front. Does he really believe that? It seems so countercultural to speak about judgment in our modern world. Our world's dismissed it. No accountability. Certainly no judgment at the end of time. The only problem with that is God says something different. God says something different. He shows it to us here in Jonah chapter 2, that he will judge even his own people for their sins. And we're told in the book of Hebrews that it's appointed for you and I once to die and then to face judgment. See, here is the thing, whether you agree with it or not, whether you like it or not, whether you want it or not, does not change the truth that God is a sovereign God who will judge sinners for their sinfulness. And the wages of sin is death. And that means each one of us here will face the grave. We'll face it. And we'll face it for our sin. That means you will face it. See, now you're saying to yourselves, I'm so glad I came this morning. Well, I know it's not a great topic to talk about. I know it's very uncomfortable to talk about, which is why I want to bring you back to Jonah chapter 2. Because in the depths of the grave, which is a frightening picture, just for the record, it's not a picture without hope. In fact, there is a promise of hope in the picture. Now, go back to verse 2. See, Jonah knows that he's facing death. Realizing his fate, he does the only thing that he possibly can. Did you see it there? In my distress, I called to the Lord. In my distress, I called to the Lord. Isn't it ironic that in our moments of fear, in our moments of distress, in our moments of worry, we call to the very person we're running away from? Isn't that ironic? Have you noticed that in some of your non-Christian friends who deny God? When the wheels fall off, it's to God they cry. I don't think that is the greatest shock here. There's an even greater shock. It's not that Jonah in his distress called to the Lord. It's what follows that. Did you pick it up? And the Lord answered him. The Lord answered him. He called for help, verse 2, and God listened to his cry. The very God that he has abandoned and rejected, the very God that he has turned from his word and run from his presence, when he calls out to him, that God is not only there, he listens, and he doesn't only listen, he hears. He hears. See, here's the glorious picture. That Jonah might have abandoned God, but God has not abandoned Jonah. See, God is not absent from judgment, because judgment is not the end. Death is not the end. And ultimately, that's what Jonah holds on to. He holds on to the promise of life beyond the grave. Yes, have a look at verse 4. He knows. He knows that he has been banished from God's sight. He knows that. That's what death will do to him. And yet he will, look at his hope, he will look again toward God's holy temple. The day will come when he will once again be in God's presence, even if for a little while he has been banished from his sight. Yes, he knows, verse 6, that he is in the grave. He is in the depths of the despair. He knows he is in prison, but he also knows that God will bring his life up from the pit. See, that's the good news, dear friends. The good news of the gospel is death is not the end for God's people. Now, we have the hope of resurrection. We have the hope of life beyond the grave, life after death. And so Jonah's hope is actually in God himself. Put the two things together. Yes, we've seen that God in his righteousness brings judgment and death to sin. But here's what Jonah is experiencing. He's experiencing that same God in his mercy brings salvation and life to those who cry out to him. See, Jonah's hope is in knowing God. Is in knowing God's character, in knowing God's goodness, in knowing that ultimately in the belly of the fish, judgment and mercy will meet. It's the second thing I want us to think about this morning, not just from the depths of the grave, but will you look down at verse 9 and see that salvation comes from the Lord. Jonah knew that his God is ultimately the saving God, the God who rescues and redeems. He knows that salvation comes from his God, from Jehovah, from Yahweh, from the Lord. A salvation, let's be clear about, a salvation that Jonah does not deserve. A salvation that Jonah cannot earn, which is why a bit later in verse 8 he will allude to God's grace alone. Now he knows that those who cling to worthless idols, what do? They forfeit grace that could be theirs. In other words, when you think you can do this on your own, when you think you can worship the way you want to, how you want to, when you want to, these idols that you cling to, when you want to make it about you, well, that won't work. And when you make it about you, you forfeit the grace, the undeserved merit of God, the undeserved favor of God. And so what we discover in the grace of God is we discover that what initially looks like the judgment of Jonah actually turns out to be his salvation. Did you pick that up? You see, at the start, he is in despair and in distress. At the start, he's lost sight of everything good. And then he remembers God, and he remembers God's grace. And he understands that salvation comes from God. And as he turns back to the Lord in faith, do you see what happens? He becomes a new man. He becomes actually a person of grace himself. He becomes transformed by grace. Do you see it there, verse 9? See, he knows this is not the final say. Now, he's a new man. He will see God not just as his judge, but as his redeemer. He will respond to this God, this saving God, in faith and worship. I can't imagine what it must be like to think you are in the depths of the grave, whether you understand that as the belly of the fish or the place of the dead, and say to them, I will sing a song of thanksgiving. I will sing a song of thanksgiving. What must it take to be in that situation and be so transformed by God that you can say in the midst of despair, but I will sing with a song of thanksgiving. See, friends, that's grace. No longer will he live for himself. Remember, that's what he's been doing since we met him back in chapter 1. No, now he will offer sacrifices to God. Now he will do what he vowed to make good. And I take it that's when he became a prophet. And he vowed to serve the Lord and to tell the world what God told him to tell them. See, he'll make good on the vows he made previously. And what you and I are meant to get to by the time we get to verse 9 is that Jonah has actually returned to God's presence. And he has returned to God's word. See, grace has restored him. Grace has restored him. One writer says the deeper work of God took place not in the belly of the fish, but in the heart of the prophet. Not in the realm of nature, but in the realm of grace. See, it was in the belly of the fish that you and I see that judgment and mercy meet. It's there that we are to come to the conclusion that our God is the God of both judgment and salvation. Because sometimes we separate those two things. Wicked old God, Old Testament God, nice New Testament God. No, the scriptures don't give us that freedom, friends. Our God is the God of both judgment on sin and salvation by grace. And you want to know where you see that supremely? You see that in the work of Jesus. I'm going to ask you a question. If you get it right, you can have a free cup of coffee today. If you were Jesus and wanted to compare yourself to all the great prophets of the Old Testament, who would you compare yourself to? Think about it for a sec. All the Old Testament prophets he could be. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Elisha, Elijah. For all the great prophets, who would you choose to be if you were Jesus? I'll give you 3 guesses which prophet Jesus compares himself to. And the first 2 tries don't count, because it should be pretty obvious. Of all the prophets that Jesus could compare himself to, he compares himself to Jonah. This is what he says in Matthew chapter 12. He says, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man, will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." See, Jesus actually tells us what's going on in Jonah chapter 2. He says Jonah chapter 2 is where death and deliverance meet. Jonah chapter 2 is where judgment and salvation meet. And Jesus understood that the cross is where death and deliverance will meet, where judgment and mercy will meet. You see, he understands that he too will enter the grave, the place of the dead, the depths of the grave for 3 days and for 3 nights. And he will do that as judgment for sin. Why? Because when he does that for judgment for sin, so he will secure salvation by grace for those who trust him. And so the sign of Jonah that he goes on to speak about in Matthew's gospel is the great truth, the great hope that amidst judgment, God provides salvation. A salvation that satisfies his judgment through the death of Jesus. And so if we sit here today and the thought of judgment horrifies us and terrifies us, which truthfully it should, then can I tell you to keep reading? Because it's not all the story. No, this is the story of salvation. It's the story of rescue. It's the story of a God who does what is necessary that his people can escape the grave, can escape judgment, can find salvation. And if you and I want salvation instead of judgment, well, then we too must abandon worthless idols. We too must cling to the grace that is ours. And we know where it's ours. It's ours in Jesus at the foot of the cross. See, that's the grace we must cling to. Not what we do, but what God does for us. When he takes sin on his shoulders, when he enters the grave in our place, that we might have life. Transformed by the grace of God. And so grace should transform you and me, because many of us here today will say, well, we're not under judgment, Luke, we're under salvation. We're in the second half of the story. Well, can I remind you then that grace should transform you too? You too should be standing in awe and wonder of God and what He's done for you. Your heart should be overflowing with thankfulness. Indeed, you too should be singing Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. You too should be living a life of thanksgiving marked by gratitude to God. You too should be serving God in the obedience of faith, offering your sacrifices to Him, which is yourself, your body and soul, walking in obedience to Him, keeping the vows you've made to Him. In other words, our life of thanksgiving is expressed in a life of service, a life marked by compassion for others, a life marked by a desire to see them flee judgment and be saved. See, I wonder if we've realized that if we are partakers of God's grace, then we've got a mission. Our mission is to warn those who face the grave that salvation is possible. We've got a message to declare about God's grace, about God's goodness, about what God has done for them at the cross. We've got a salvation to announce to them. And so we should too live a life marked by grace. See, when salvation comes from the Lord, it doesn't come to leave us where we once were. It comes to change us and transform us, to make us new people, that we can live differently from that day onwards. In my sick sense of humor, I try to imagine what it must have been like if he didn't actually realize he was inside a fish. If maybe in the swirling of the drowning, in the currents of the water, maybe he lost compass mentis of where he was. And so he genuinely thought that he was dead. He genuinely thought he was in the place of the dead, in the grave. Because I'm guessing he hadn't been there before, so he didn't really know what it looked like. And so here he is. He's in the belly of the fish, but he thinks it's game over, at least until the resurrection. Can you imagine what a shock it must have been as he heard the grumbling noises? And I love the way the passage speaks. And then the Lord commanded the fish. Can you imagine? You don't realize you think you are dead. You think you are dead and it's game over. The next thing, you've vomited all over the beach. What a shock that must have been. See, for Jonah, the new life came much quicker than I think he anticipated. Much quicker. You see, he knew his God was the God of second chances. He just didn't realize how quick the second chance was going to come for him. Verse 10 must have been a huge surprise. Jonah, you are not dead. Oh, you smell like you are, but you're not really. No, Jonah, you're alive. You're alive. Your second chance has come. Jonah, what will you do with it this time? What will you do with it, Jonah? When chapter 3 starts, come back next week anyway, but when chapter 3 starts with almost the identical words of chapter 1, Jonah, what will you do this time? What will you do? I know this is not a pleasant thought, but I want you to imagine for a moment that a fish has just vomited you up onto the beach. By that I mean, I want you to imagine you have just escaped judgment. You've just escaped judgment. You've just escaped the grave. You've been renewed by grace. You've been transformed by grace. You've been made a new person, and you've been given a fresh start, which is what's happened if you're a Christian. You've got a new start. And so can I ask you, what will you do with that? What will you do with that? Because God did not rescue Jonah from the grave to let him go back to where he was. And I want to assure you, God has not rescued you from the grave to let you go back where you once were. Now, His grace comes so that we will be different every day henceforth. You'll see Jonah's story is in many respects our story. And so as we come to know God better through his prayer in Jonah chapter 2, you and I should find ourselves in one of two positions this morning. And there are only two positions. See, either we know we haven't turned to Jesus, and therefore we are still facing judgment for our sins in and of ourselves. And if that's you today, then I want to remind you, dear friend, that you need to act while you still have time. You, like Jonah, need to call out to the Lord in your distress. You need to acknowledge your sin and your guilt. You need to abandon the worthless idols that you are clinging to. You need to ask God for mercy and for grace, in the assurance that if you ask him, he will hear and he will give it to you. And if that's you and you want to talk to somebody about that, I'd love to chat with you after the service. I'd love for us to be able to talk about how you can receive God's gracious gift of salvation, that you too can declare salvation comes from the Lord. But my guess is most of us here today will fall into the second category. That is the group who've already received grace, who've already received salvation. My question to you then is, are you singing out in thanksgiving? Are you singing out in thanksgiving? Is your life so transformed that you understand you've got salvation for eternity? You've been rescued from the grave. Is your life marked by praise for God, praise for Jesus who took your judgment? Are you living in light of Christ each and every day? Are you asking him for the strength to obey him and to walk with him? And are you willing? Are you willing to proclaim the good news of salvation from Jesus to the ends of the earth? See, either today you are calling out in distress or you are singing out in thanksgiving. Which is you today? Which is you?